present. Let that load. How's that look, Sarah?
Looks good to me.
Great. All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this CMP CCNet webinar today. We have 90 people registered to participate today, which really shows the great interest in this topic. Today, we're going to talk about holistic approaches to achieve healthy, resilient social ecological systems. My name is Elizabeth O'Neill. I'm an independent consultant, but I've been involved with CMP and been a conservation standards coach for almost 20 years. So I don't have official CMP membership. I like to say that rather than adjunct or emeritus, I'm ad nauseum CMP member. And it's really great to be here with you. I'm speaking to you because I facilitated this learning initiative on this topic at the end of last year. I'm going to share back some of the results with you today. So the learning initiative itself was actually part of a series. There were several of these learning initiatives going on at the same time, funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And the purpose of this one was to harness the collective knowledge of CMP and CCNet and others really, and use cross-organizational learning on priority topics to help inform and improve conservation action on the ground. And what the Moore Foundation really wanted us to do this time was to focus on strategies and conservation actions versus more tools and methods for conservation planning, monitoring, and evaluation. And the strategies that were chosen by the CMP community were all people-oriented. So the three that moved forward were holistic approaches for social ecological systems, this one on environment and development agendas and links to conservation, and then another one on population health and environment. And I'm sure you're thinking, wow, there's probably a lot of overlap that happened among those. And indeed there was. And if you're sitting in on the other Learning Initiative webinars, that's what you'll hear. Just as a quick overview for the initiative itself, the product was a deck-based report giving an overview and definition of this particular strategy, a theory of change, and considerations for design and implementation. That desk-based report in the end was 85 slides, and they're reading slides, they're not presentation slides. And so what I'm going to try to summarize for you today is kind of a high-level representation of that work. But I would really encourage you, and we'll provide the link in the chat later. If you're interested in this topic, I would really encourage you to actually go and page through that deck. The authors of this work, the participants in the working group, there were 30 people spanning conservation and other social change work. The intended audiences included conservation and other social change organizations, policymakers, companies, and funders, and maybe even researchers. This was a really rapid process. We had 3 virtual convenings over 3 months, so from September to November. We did 2 really big content surveys, 1 evaluation survey, and then a lot of iterative generation of concepts, decisions, findings, and recommendations. We had tremendous participation by the working group, but it was a really big topic in very little time with limited budget. This was a new learning approach for CMP, and it was all virtual because of COVID. So I like to say that what we've generated is a really nice tip of the iceberg, because this is a very complicated and kind of nuanced subject. So just definitionally, I wanted to touch on a couple of key concepts before I really launch into this. So what is a holistic approach for social ecological systems? So first, I just wanted to play this video, which was put together by the Stockholm Resilience Center on social ecological systems. In this approach, we considered a social ecological system as the ultimate focal target. And that ultimately you'd want to see is that that system is thriving and resilient in places where you're working on systems like that. So sorry about that, but look, basically the idea is that in these places where you have natural resources you care about, high biodiversity, high conservation value areas, and you have people living there, and particularly resource-dependent communities, we have to think about it as one integrated system versus trying to deal just with the component parts that we feel we really care about, because ultimately all the different pieces really affect one another. Let's see if I can get, no, don't go again. No, go. Okay. So the other piece of the title and the overall topic of this talk and of the work is holistic approach, and a holistic approach to a social ecological system. And we worked a lot as a working group on the definition of that. And so I'm just going to read it actually, because we were very careful with the wording. So a holistic social ecological approach recognizes the profound interdependence between the well-being of people and the health of the world's biodiversity. The approach champions both of these through collaborations that negotiate and advance holistic solutions for the good of people and nature. Such collaborations may include local land and resource holders, NGOs, government reps, and other relevant stakeholders. And the priorities of local land and resource holders are paramount, but ultimate intervention objectives reflect negotiated solutions that support and balance diverse interests and ultimately visions. We really tried hard to come up with a clear description of what this is, and tried to do it in a way that makes clear how this is different. What's really important to consider is when you think about the priorities of local land resource holders and those priorities being paramount and coming together in a vision, that vision will include not just natural resources components, right? It will necessarily include, for example, in the way that the Field Museum supports visioning, it may include aspects that are cultural, social, economic, political. It really depends on how people want to define that future. And so understanding that array of objectives is really fundamental to this approach. Why do we need more and better holistic approaches to achieve thriving, sustainable social ecological systems? As most of us know, Indigenous and local people are owners and stewards of a very significant portion of the world's biodiversity. If we only look at Indigenous people, 370 million of them globally approximately, they make up less than 5% of the total human population, but manage or hold tenure over 25% of the world's land surface and about 80% of global biodiversity. And at the same time, needs among these communities are also significant. Those Indigenous communities make up about 15% of the world's extreme poor and a third of the rural poor. And again, the research we did mostly spoke to Indigenous communities, but if we include other local natural resource dependent communities, all of these figures would go up. At the same time, even knowing this, and of course we've all worked under these with this understanding for a long time, at the same time, the working group, when we said, how often do you experience situations where you think a more holistic strategy, in other words, one that advances an array of interdependent conservation and human well-being objectives, is needed but not being employed? 21 out of 23 people said, yeah, that happens either often or very frequently. So we're not employing approaches typically that are sufficiently multifaceted, or not doing them well enough to attain or sustain desired and interdependent conservation and human well-being aims. And even where we are pursuing more integrated approaches, we all know, we've all seen the ICDP research, right? That says that results tend to fall short in integrated programming. And we asked the working group in the survey where you see these integrated programs, to what extent are conservation aims being achieved or human well-being, both or neither? And a lot of people said neither. And a few people said, well, not conservation, but some human well-being advancement. And others said some conservation advancement, but not human well-being. And if you could all just make sure that you're on mute, that would be super helpful. And of course, these views are consistent. The views of the working group are consistent with research on past effectiveness of ICDPs. For example, in a review of 36 ICDPs, only 5 contributed directly to wildlife conservation. And other studies show that the indirect approach favored by ICDPs of providing alternative sources of products, inputs, income, and social benefits are best described as conservation by distraction. But given that environmental health and human well-being are often interdependent in social ecological systems, and again, it's like was shown in the video, which hopefully you got some glimpses of and the general gist of, it's really that interaction that determines whether or not the whole system thrives in the end, right? So the answer isn't to give up on integrated programming, but to get better at it. So we asked as a working group, why aren't these integrated or more single sector, let's say a really conservation focused approach, why isn't it working? And we did quite a detailed situation assessment, which I'll summarize for you here. And the idea being that if we adopt a better, more holistic approach, hopefully that will remedy some of these challenges that we identified in the situation assessment, including identification and engagement of collaborators wherein conservation NGOs approach rights holders as threats versus owners, leaders, and intended beneficiaries. And at the same time, that kind of narrow approach, that also can be said of many other social change organizations, right? This sort of externally imposed model. Another challenge is that approaches historically have often been done for or to local land resource holders rather than with, impeding an inclusive, equitable collaboration. Often we see a lack of definition of a shared vision that reflects the full array of needs and aspirations of all collaborators, local people, NGOs, maybe local government, toward which they commit to work as equal partners. So again, coming in saying, what's your vision for the future and what's our role in helping you to realize that, versus our vision for the future for you is that you can serve all of these natural resources, and how can we work with you to get you to work toward our vision, which is what we often see in conservation in particular. All of that can lead to a situation analysis that's overly narrow, failing to recognize these interdependencies we've been talking about. And then, of course, none of this is operating in a closed system. There are external constraints and issues that are influencing whether or not more integrated approaches are effective, or even single sector approaches are effective, including operating environment constraints like unsupportive or undermining policy environments, and implementation constraints. And this came up a lot. People feel like there'd be more and better integrated or holistic programming going on if the funding models out there supported it. But in fact, they tend to be too single sector, too narrow, short term, and not flexible enough to support integration activities. So we have all of these challenges working. And as a result, strategies to mitigate direct negative influences on human well-being and environmental health fall short, because they fail to respond effectively to the complexity and nature of the situation. So even if we see near-term positive impacts being realized, often they're a lot less than we hope. And you don't necessarily see great indicators of long-term sustainability, because the local constituency, capacity, and capital required to maintain and amplify impacts haven't been established. You haven't established that local leadership, the right crowd of people with the right capacity, with the right resources, with the right will and ownership to drive the vision forward. And so we don't see results being realized to the desired extent or sustained. So how is this approach that we're talking about, how is it different from, say, ICDPs that we've seen in the past, or single sector approaches? So we looked at a few different case studies in the course of our work together in the working group, one of which was the Tuangani project in Tanzania. And Cheryl Margolius is on the call and really worked closely with me on this particular case study. So this is a project in Tanzania that's carried out by local communities, the Nature Conservancy and Pathfinder principally, although there are other partners that have been involved and are currently involved. And it advances an integrated, interdependent set of activities to promote health and resilience of families, forests, and fisheries. They work at multiple scales: community level, policy, district level, and a lot of this work comes together around this concept of model households, where environmental health is advanced hand in hand with human well-being. The ultimate outcomes of the work, when you talk to all the folks who are involved in it, there are certainly proximate results regarding threat mitigation. There's a priority park and forest and chimpanzees in this area. There are important fisheries. So there are proximate results regarding threat mitigation to those targets, and also targeted proximate improvements in human well-being. But, if you talk to the project leader on the ground, he talks a lot about, really what you're working for is a change in mindset that will influence decisions, behavior, and resilience over the long term. And mindset wherein conservation of the environment, environmental health is prioritized right alongside and as part of the community's vision for their future, with education and health and economic well-being. So this focus on the long term as well as near term is a key characteristic of a more holistic approach. A holistic approach is characterized by a set of important hallmarks. So if you're still saying, well, I still don't get it, how is this different? Hopefully this will help. So again, a focus on the social ecological system, so a true systems-based approach that includes people in that space as well as elements of the environment. Inclusive, equitable collaboration, similar to the graphic at left, including considerations of gender. Always working with this idea of interdependency between well-being of people and health of the environment. Respect for local rights holders as decision makers and leaders, and enabling attainment of their visions for the future, not just their visions for their environment, but their visions for themselves, their lives, their families, their communities. Alignment around an advancement of a shared vision. So trying to figure out, well, how do we, because we're here as an NGO, we have an agenda, right? So, and communities will define their agenda, their vision, the way they'll define it. We have to figure out how to align those visions and how to advance a set of objectives that's palatable to all involved, which requires honest negotiations toward pragmatic, viable cross-sectoral solutions. So coming into a local community and saying, hi, we're here to help you to make your lives better. And if you're a conservation organization, that's kind of disingenuous, isn't it? Yes, ultimately that's true, but you're there first and foremost because of the conservation targets in the place, most likely, right? You're there to serve your own agenda first. And if you're not forthcoming with that and wanting to work with people toward that agenda, then that's not as honest as it needs to be. In fact, it's probably not even consistent with free, prior, informed consent if you're not fully disclosing why you're there first and foremost and why you're trying to engage those folks. And then working toward near-term impact and shifts in mindset and behavior as needed to attain long-term sustainability. Something I've been talking a lot about, the concept of maybe conversion resistance. So you may achieve work with local people in the near term, but if palm oil comes down the road, which it may, even in the case of Tuangani, there's a new road. Ideally, you have enough local ownership, leadership, capacity, buy-in, environment as part of the vision, that folks will make decisions that will continue to support environmental health in addition to other aspects of their own well-being. A holistic approach differs importantly from an ICDP. You can probably already imagine ICDPs are often two buckets, right? Conservation and development, or conservation and poverty alleviation. They can be more focused on one bucket or the other. Very often the agendas are more externally imposed versus internally led. A holistic approach aims to be more whole system, inclusive, and responsive to the array of needs, advancing interdependent objectives together, and derived first with and from local people. This is going to be an oversimplification, but you may also be thinking, okay, well, we did all this work on where human well-being fits in the conservation standards. And from a conservation perspective, where we landed makes sense, right? If you're really a strict conservation organization, it may make sense to you to think, well, we influence human well-being primarily by ensuring ecosystem services are maintained. Right. And then we also work on other aspects of human well-being where we identify that they're critical to mitigate threats to our targets. They tend to kind of come in those two different ways. In a holistic approach, it comes more from the perspective of seeing local people first as rights holders, leaders, and enabling conditions, based on the hypothesis that social, cultural, economic, environmental, and political governance aspects need to be in a social ecological system need to be in good condition for desired impacts to be achieved, and most importantly, sustained. So if you have a system where you're reliant on local people to not use resources unsustainably, we all know that they need a viable economic solution that is going to work for them for the longer term. You know, in most cases, basket weaving or making bracelets, it's just not, it's not going to cut it. It may offset some unsustainable behavior in the near term, but it's probably not going to meet the long-term needs that they may have. And if you ask them really what their vision is, you know, what they really want is enough money to send their kids to school, to pay for medicine, to have nicer homes, just like any of us, right? So this concept, the holistic approach, really tries to be more pragmatic about that from the beginning. Like consistent with other community-based approaches, holistic approaches try to give diligent attention to fundamental principles that underpin engagement, including justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, free, prior, informed consent, gender considerations, etc. I just want to say that although, and don't read all the detail, but this is really just to give you a sense of the universe that's out there. Although holistic approaches, as we're defining them, are not in wide use. And in fact, a lot of this is us kind of trying to land on a concept that's still relatively new. There is an array of relevant frameworks out there, examples, research, projects that are underway, and other resources, and we've collected those as part of the working group. So how does a holistic approach work? One of our central tasks as a working group was to develop a theory of change that we could then load into CAML, the Conservation Actions and Measures Library. If you're not familiar with that and you work with results chains and theories of change for conservation programming in particular, go look for it. It basically means you don't have to start from scratch for a whole array of conservation strategies. So we were tasked with putting a theory of change together for each of these strategies that the learning initiatives looked at. I'm going to take a shot at describing this to you. I don't expect you to read all the detail. I'm going to summarize this, but just so you can see that we work through a theory of change. So the idea is that to get a holistic approach off the ground, you need to first ensure that certain enabling conditions are in place. Obviously, funding for integration and some degree of duration is important. If you're really going to affect long-term social change and maintain that, that takes a lot of time. And that's part of that pragmatism that's central to this approach. You need to make sure there's basic capacity, ability, willingness to participate on all parts. And that gets back to free, prior, informed consent. If you're going to engage communities in this, they need to understand what you're asking them to get involved in and why. A good detailed understanding of the stakeholder landscape so that you can appropriately engage. For example, when you think about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, in order to really fulfill that, you need to have a good understanding of who all is there and power dynamics and what proper or appropriate representation would look like. So assuming you can get those conditions lined up, ideally you can take some first steps toward developing an equitable collaboration, again based in free, prior, informed consent, really honest. An organization I work with called Legato, and that we have some reps on here, we talk about radical communication where everybody's really forthcoming. Why are we here? What are we trying to do together? Do we actually want to go forward? And determining whether this kind of approach is appropriate, and then saying, yeah, okay, let's work together. Right? Then hopefully that work on the holistic vision happens, where you think about the full array of needs, aspirations of all involved, and try to define a shared vision. And important to this is balancing tensions and trade-offs, right? Because you could certainly work with a community, and many of us have, right? Where people say, you know, palm oil would make us a lot of money. So that's our vision for our place. We want to, you know, change over what's the resource base here into something that's really productive economically, and that's our vision. Obviously, there's tension there if you're a conservation organization bringing a priority that is conserving that same habitat. So obviously there are some challenging discussions that could happen there when you start really having honest conversations about what local people want and need. But assuming you can get that vision defined, you move to the strategy stage with good understanding of the barriers, opportunities, enabling conditions. All this is consistent with the standards, but just again, thinking about that broader array of both social agenda as well as conservation agenda. And of course, the social agenda could include a conservation agenda. And identifying a comprehensive set of solutions that navigate trade-offs that you want to work on together. Hopefully, assuming you can get the right enabling conditions in place to implement your strategy, collaborators developed and adopt a program of work that moves all of those priorities forward, that then gets you to direct threat or other key factor mitigation in order to advance environmental health and human well-being. And alongside that, achieving conditions for long-term sustainability, including ownership, leadership, institutions, tenure may be needed, plans, governance, right? Really trying to work on that from the outset. I do a lot of project and program evaluation, And in any evaluation, as many of you will know, we're asked to look at sustainability. And it's not just sustainability of the work in the program, but sustainability of the results. And I have to tell you, most programs I look at are not actively working on establishing necessary conditions for long-term sustainability. It's sort of assumed that those are lining up through the other work. But in fact, if you look at those key factors, I always summarize as constituency, capacity, capital. In fact, those are not necessarily being established, and they won't just happen from a lot of standard programming. Those need to be designed and built in right from the beginning, which a holistic approach tends to work on more directly. Ideally, if you're mitigating threats as key factors, establishing conditions for long-term sustainability, ideally, that's helping you to get to a social ecological system that's thriving. And if you're getting to those results, hopefully there's a bit of a feedback that happens. And again, we're getting sort of theoretical here, right? There's one thing we talked about is that there's not a lot of proof of concept in this case. So ideally what happens if you're getting all those results, that would expand understanding of interdependencies and increase buy-in and participation in this approach. And hopefully if you're demonstrating positive results, hopefully that will lead to increased support for approaches like this, including policy support, government engagement, and funding. So that's the basics of the theory of change. Those results break all the rules, right? Because there are so many words in each of those blue boxes. But because it's really early days with fleshing out this approach, we kept more detail in rather than trying to streamline too early. I'm conscious of time. So when is a holistic approach needed and appropriate? I mean, really the group said, look, if there's clear interdependence and it's beneficial to attain a mindset of that interdependence, if you have people coexisting with nature, you probably need to do something like this, right? And it's appropriate where you have a critical representative and committed mass. Local residents have or are seeking autonomy and ownership over their future. There's long-term commitment on the parts of key actors, a willingness and ability of all parties to be flexible. But by and large, I think the group was leaning toward feeling like, look, if you're working in a social ecological system, so people are a fundamental part of the system and a fundamental part of achieving long-term sustainability and resilience, then you probably need to be doing something that looks like this. So, like I said, we ended up producing an 85 slide reading deck as the final product. So I've given you a really high level overview so far of where the working group landed with this concept. But there's a lot more in that full report. So the group went a little further to flesh out, for example, key barriers to launching and designing holistic approaches, for example, related to the funding landscape or NGO partnership formation, key challenges to implementation, like maintaining alignment on those objectives, moving forward on the full vision, staffing integrated approaches, community and collaboration dynamics, and again, funding came up over and over again. And they worked on tactics to mitigate and launch design and implementation challenges focused on funding, awareness, capacity, partnership development, and this lack of proof of concept. And we worked up some priority research and learning questions because we feel like it's this concept, this idea, there's some great work happening out there, but it's still relatively nascent, right? It's not representative of the paradigm shift that I think a lot of us feel is needed. There's not that groundswelling of uptake yet. The deck also contains two really good, useful case studies of more holistic approaches in action. One is the Tuangani case, which I mentioned, and Cheryl's on the call. If you have questions about, what does this look like in practice, Cheryl can speak to that. And there's another one on an assets-based approach to conservation and well-being, and that looks at two different landscapes. That's led by staff from the Field Museum, and they are also on this call. We also looked at the work of Legato, which is another organization that's advancing a holistic model, and they're on this call. And we looked at healthy country planning, which started out of Australia through Bush Heritage and now is being advanced by different folks. And Saras Kumar is on the call and she works on that model. So if you have specific questions or you're like, well, what does this actually look like in terms of an example? Feel free to ask those questions now because there are a bunch of people on the call who can speak to that. Here's my buddy Makuba from Central African Republic looking ahead. So beyond the final report that we generated, obviously it would be great if there was a lot more effort put into refining this approach and advancing its uptake, support for it, effective execution. The working group by and large said, yeah, I would like to continue on this trajectory. Let's keep working on this. This was helpful. Looking into 2021, some things that we thought could be worth doing would be developing a guidance document on holistic approaches, maybe writing and circulating an open letter to funders regarding the need for increased and longer term funding for these approaches, and developing and providing a basic orientation to holistic approaches. We're kind of doing that today, but we would do it more as kind of a guidelines type thing versus just this overview. So just to conclude, you're all on this call because you saw this title and you were like, I'm pretty sure that's talking about something that I think is really important, right? That's my guess. And the working group members also participated thinking we really need to get better at this. I think many of us feel like we really need to shift up how we're working, particularly in social ecological systems with resource dependent communities, with local land and resource holders. We need to kind of shift up how we're approaching that work, how we're carrying it out. There's a paradigm shift that needs to happen, kind of turning it on its head where we're not always coming in pushing our agenda first, but seeing our agenda as hopefully part of a larger agenda that would be locally owned and led into the future. So this requires a paradigm shift, particularly understanding that a significant portion of the world's biodiversity is in the hands of Indigenous and local people. And if you're in a conservation organization, we need to figure out how to work effectively with those folks. And many of them depend on those natural resources for their well-being. Despite that, so far, efforts in conservation and other social change sectors in these complex systems tend to not be sufficiently multifaceted, proactive, or well executed to attain or sustain desired conservation and human well-being aims. And that's not just conservation organizations, right? We all know that poverty alleviation, population health organizations, organizations working on education also tend to be really single sector, even though they're ultimately trying to advance human well-being that is probably dependent on environmental health as well. And yet they're not incorporating environmental health in most cases nearly as well as the conservation sector is trying to incorporate social considerations. So many of us believe a paradigm shift is needed such that more holistic approaches become the norm in these systems. And so although we crafted a really great tip of the iceberg for this approach, significant work remains to further elaborate and advance uptake. And ideally, that work will continue into the coming year. We've asked for some additional funding, and we'll see if we can figure out how to get resources to continue the conversation. So that's what I have for now. Now what we wanted to do was to take questions, and there are 30 comments in the chat. So I imagine there are questions in there. Sarah, you've been looking through those. Are there any that you could prioritize?
Yeah, so most of them are comments. So apologies. Yeah, people asking where they can find the report. So I put the report in the chat for you if you'd like to go see the whole thing. There's quite a number of great comments from David Wilkie about other projects that you may have that also involve holistic approaches, and talking about building trust with communities and how that's incredibly vital. And another comment about the letter to funders and how that would be great. Okay, David, I see you have your hand raised.
Elizabeth, that was great.
Okay.
I think one of the things that I've been pushing at WCS is that many current and future conservation challenges will not get solved by classic conservation, which is you establish protected areas or other effective area-based conservation measures, and you put in governance systems, and you manage natural resources. Those are all great, but I frankly think that unless we get the food production sector on board, unless we get the public health in sectors engaged, there's just stuff that we'll be holding back the waves, the tide. And I just think that future conservation is going to have to be multi-sectoral. We're going to have to bring the small poultry producing NGOs in with the family birth spacing NGOs, and all of us have got to work together, all because it advances our own missions. We shouldn't expect WWF or WCS to become a family planning organization. We shouldn't expect WCS to become a fish pond a production system. But we need to make partnerships with non-traditional sectors because their efforts are going to be vital to our efforts.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I didn't emphasize that as much, but partnership is absolutely going to be key in this. People say, I think some people, when they look at this, they think, oh, this is going to involve a lot of mission drift. No, not necessarily, but it may require you to reach out and more proactively partner than you have in the past, because there are these critical factors or conditions that need to be met as defined by local people for the long-term thriving future of that system. And so you may need to proactively reach out and bring in those partners to help to realize that vision and that healthy system. And that's something that we don't see very often. And that may mean, like David was saying, reaching out to partners that are not partners we've traditionally looked to. They may be private sector in many cases. We haven't really done that well in a lot of places. There are examples, certainly, but trying to do more of that, engaging industry and sustainability. If you look at the seafood sector, the whole future of sustainable seafood is not a conservation and environment agenda. It's getting industry on board and getting industry to own that and advance that agenda. So it's going to be a different look, ideally, in the future, if we're more honest about what it's going to take to make this work. Other questions or comments? Anyone, even anybody who's like, yes, this is right on the mark. This is what I've been thinking. I'd love to talk about this more. Or if you have questions or concerns. Peter Cranswick. I don't know you, Peter. What do you got?
Hi there. Trying to start my video. It seems rude not to, but thank you very much. That was really great. I really enjoyed that. A question then, and I agree completely with the principle. One we're struggling a bit with some of the projects we're doing. I'm aware in conservation standards we have this thing called human well-being target, but to my knowledge, we've never actually set targets. It seems much sales pitch, say, do some biodiversity conservation, and there's some benefits for you. I'm just thinking, to what extent has any of these or your review picked up that people genuinely set human well-being targets that are integrated with that arrow, as you show, going back and forward? And is that more powerful? Does that get better buy-in? Is that something the community can then engage with much better?
Yeah, it definitely does happen. I see Sarah's clicking off. Can you answer that one?
Yeah, well, so with Healthy Country Planning, which has been an adaptation of conservation standards co-designed with Indigenous people in Australia. So that one, actually, the human well-being is not, a kind of outcome or interrelated. The targets are actually all together. So the conservation targets and the human well-being targets are lumped together as part of that whole system. So we're still working on how to support Indigenous communities to, use the conservation or healthy country planning process to really define those targets. So they have things like livelihoods, community well-being, and of course all the, the cultural, spiritual aspects as well. So those are the three probably main targets that come up, and they'll work out what the kind of viability of that is. But it's, I think from our perspective, we're really trying to work on, what are the right questions to ask, and how do you, actually get the indicators and measure all of that. And strategies usually come out pretty easily when you're talking to them. But yeah, it's very much an integrated approach in healthy country planning because it follows an Indigenous worldview.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you certainly see programs like if you look at Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, there are communities all the way around that park, and they have all kinds of efforts around education, health, economic advancement, agriculture, right alongside the park objectives. Unfortunately, in that case, what you also see, though, is a lack of building in to everybody's mindset that idea of interdependence, and also a bit of quid pro quo. Like, the park is helping you, local people, because ideally that's also going to lead to behavior change that helps the park, right? And that's part of that honest, pragmatic conversation that maybe isn't happening to the extent that it needs to. So you see all those folks benefiting from social services provided by the park and still setting snares all the way around the perimeter of the park. Right. So, you know, you also don't see, you see some of those objectives maybe advancing in a suite where you have human well-being and conservation targets, but that what's missing is that integrated, that interdependence that's translating to mindset and behavior change. So certainly you see it a lot, but whether or not it's getting you really where you're trying to go from a social or environmental standpoint, I think that's yet another layer of challenge.
Great, thank you both.
Other questions or comments?
We had a question in the chat about, is there a place that all of these great examples are collated or could be for people to read about?
We can provide a link to the archive we started to put together, but I'm also seeing, like, Reynaldo is putting tons of examples in there. A lot of you are offering up other examples, and we didn't do an exhaustive search. So that would be part of the next step here, would be to gather more of those examples. But we, let's see, Philippa's not on. We can provide to you all a link in the follow-up email to the archive that we put together so far.
Great. And another comment / question, that working on community level scales can be challenging between working on that scale and then larger scales to maintain biodiversity, and how the difference in scales of working on this type of issue are quite challenging.
Yeah, I know that the Field Museum talks about this a lot, working across scales. I know the Tuangani project is working more and more across scales. I wonder if anybody from either of those would like to talk about that and how you're navigating that need to work across scales.
I'm happy to if helpful.
Yeah, great.
I can just say that you know, in Tuangani we partner. So this is Cheryl Margolius. I work for Pathfinder International, and we partner with the Nature Conservancy in a project called Tuangani in Western Tanzania, and we have interventions designed to achieve conservation goals, to achieve health and well-being goals, which include livelihoods, and an integrated component that sort of combines these. And we have interventions designed at the community level and at the district level, and then at the national level, and then at the regional EAC level, in order to have, you know, our field operations supported by supportive policies and sort of budget lines as you go up the government chain for reasons for sustainability, really, and buy-in.
Great, thank you. I think Anna's on. I don't know if Tita, I don't think Tita's still on. Is Anna still on?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Do you want to talk? I know you guys talk about this challenge a lot too.
Yeah, it's learning how to dance and learning what the rhythm is and who you dance with, right? So we've noticed that sometimes what we do is we do quality of life plans with communities and conservation priority areas, which are strategic planning documents that communities can use in order to inform interventions by different projects, and also where should they concentrate their efforts moving forward. And what we found is that most of those priorities are conservation compatible, right? So for us, it's sort of learning, how do you elevate those things? The community is well aware, you know, of these things. So how do you, you know, elevate these things? And in particular, we are focusing on how do we think about planning at different levels? So how do we take it to the municipal planning offices to make sure that they understand and are able to read these planning documents from the community level, and also in the regional or state level, how those things sort of feed into each other, and learning how to speak their language, in the sense that planning and budgets and all these things have a specific language, objectives, like strategies. And so how do you sort of exist in all of those worlds? And it's been a learning process for us. Definitely getting to know how planners plan, how states plan, and how communities plan. In reality, it's not that different. You know, everybody wants the well-being of their people. So how do you sort of have those two worlds collide and work together for a shared objective? So that's been what we've learned. We're still learning how to do it, but we found that the best way is to sort of be these translators and build a capacity in the community and also at the government level of the duality of all of these planning documents and the different scales.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Question or comment? I think for me, one of the things that I just keep stepping back and wondering, right? Like a lot of you probably heard this presentation and you think, of course, right? Of course, we need to be working with this more. A lot of you are saying there are a bunch of people already doing this, right? And we had people in the working group who are trying to work in this way. Why is this not the way we are working consistently in the conservation sector? If we recognize, look, conservation will be just ideally one part of the agenda of local stakeholders. And we need those local stakeholders to own and carry that conservation piece of the agenda forward if it's going to succeed over the long term. Why are we not working this way consistently across our sector? What would it take to promote broader adoption and uptake of an approach like this? And it's just something that I keep grappling with. Why are we slow to make this shift when I think there's a lot of recognition that this is where we need to go? So if any of you have any perspectives on that, it could be interesting to hear from you.
Hi there, I can jump in. My name's Althea Skinner with the CARE WWF Alliance, and
yes, perfect example.
Yeah, I think that we ask ourselves this question all the time, and I think where we've come down is that A, it's hard, and B, funders don't fund it. And so that was my shout out in the chat, that I think, getting a coalition of people and institutions together to write to funders and make the case for why this is so important could be extremely powerful. I think we have to lead the way in challenging the dominant just paradigms of sectoral funding.
Yes. That came up so much in the working group as the critical obstacle is that the funding models still are very single sector. It's really interesting too, just seeing Legato, which I work with, go out fundraising and having funders come back and ask, well, what are you? Are you conservation or are you social? Right? And it's like, oh, do we have to pick one or the other? Ideally, we're about ensuring the whole system is thriving. But it just, even that is hard for a lot of funders to wrap their heads around. And yeah, we really need to drive some change there. It seems like part of that the working group was talking about is proof of concept. It does seem like there are a lot of examples out there of this happening and having good results. We probably need to do a better job of gathering that body of evidence to make the case if we're going to convince funders. But it's great to hear, Althea, that you would sign on to that open letter, or maybe a Stanford Social Innovation Review piece that some of us could put together. So I think we should think about it. David's putting his hand up. He'd sign on.
Elizabeth, I think one of the things that's really interesting is because the recovery rates of coastal marine systems are so much faster than the recovery rates of degraded terrestrial systems, it's sometimes much easier to build community trust and willingness to work in things like locally managed marine areas than it is with boreal terrestrial areas in northern Canada, where resource damage takes 20, 30, 40 years to recover. Mm-hmm. Having an integrated approach that provides communities with resources over that time frame, or gets donors interested. Hey, could you give us money for 40 years, please? I just think that the 3-year project cycle is just not working when you're trying to do things that, if you're trying to do things well and respectfully and in a participatory way, don't expect that that's going to happen at any time soon.
Yep. And I think we probably, David, just thinking about your FailFest initiative that you were trying to promote too, I feel like the body of evidence we need to collect as well is, what does it look like when we don't do it this way? When we aren't proactive, when we aren't more integrated in our thinking. If you look at the mountain gorilla parks, for example, and there was a great idea 15, 20 years ago to promote tourism, and tourists will come, they'll bring money, and then locally they'll prioritize maintaining the gorillas, and that will uplift the local economy. It sure did, such that it created these development magnets out of every one of the parks. And now most of them are hemmed in by really heavy population density, right? And so the greatest threats to the park or to the gorillas are now coming from that population density and the tourism, right? Because there wasn't that longer range thinking, and there wasn't a more integrated plan in place. So I think we still have mountain gorillas, which is great. However, the problems that we deal with now are much harder to undo than if we had been more integrated and proactive in our thinking some time ago. So part of that body of evidence too, I think we need to collect not just what's working, but what happens if you don't do this, including looking at where a lot of money has been spent and results achieved initially and then not sustained over the long term, and why that is. So I think we're at time here. I want to thank you all so much for participating, and especially thanks to the working group, particularly the members who are on here right now, but the working group really dug in on this challenging topic. And if you look at the report we generated, given the time that we had to do it, it's quite an impressive product. And I hope that you all will look at it and that you get a lot out of it, and a lot more work to be done, obviously, going forward. Sarah sends follow-up emails after these to participants, so we'll send you all a lot of great links. And I think that's all we have for now. Thanks so much.
That was a lot of fun.
Great.
Bye.